most of you. So just to explain the concept for the next 55 minutes or so while we have this room, is that we have invited you for this briefing. We are a INGO platform called Global Focus. My name is Sigrid Andersen. I'm Climate Advisor at Global Focus, and we work to advance human rights and climate justice globally. And we have spoken with Lisa and Sigurd about the possibility of talking to you who are European youth delegates about two important agendas on the climate justice agenda at the moment, which are not specifically UNFCCC related but have links to them. And just to say that we have also invited some of our colleagues from other international networks. And I think now we're a bit too many people to have a round of introductions. So just to say that's the people in the room. And what we would like to do is to give you two briefings. One of them on the case for an advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice on climate justice, on state obligations in the climate crisis. So that's the first part of the briefing. And the second part is about the civil society situation in Azerbaijan. And as you probably know by now, Azerbaijan is the incoming COP29 presidency. And for us as civil society actors, there's an importance in understanding the context of where the climate meetings take place. Firstly, to know how we can show solidarity with our colleagues across the world. And secondly, to be specific about how member states can help us get access and help us participate in the climate talks. And as we know, for a few years now, that has actually been quite limited. So that's the second theme for today. And I will just start out by introducing our first speaker, and then we just sit down so we can talk eye to eye. And actually, I would be very interested to know, just by a show of hands, for those of you who are here, thank you, how many of you are already familiar with the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, just on the level of having heard about it before? Okay, great. That's good to know. We'll make sure to fill you in, those of you who are not aware of it already. So we wanted to put focus on this case because, as Vishal will explain to us in a moment why it is an important case, it's a potential landmark case at the International Court of Justice. It's not a court case, it's what's called an advisory opinion, and we'll get back to that. But it might be the first time that we have a global legal authority to pronounce or determine what are the links between the obligations of states in the climate crisis and international law, human rights, and intergenerational equity. And that's why this case is not only relevant for existing generations on the planet, but also future generations, because the issue of intergenerational equity and the rights of children and youth is part and parcel of this case. And that's why we thought this would be interesting for you as European youth delegates to hear more about, and also to be able to have a conversation about how could you engage with this case. So without further ado, Vishal, my first question to you is, what is the case about? What is the purpose? And why is this an important issue? And if you could just briefly introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and for giving me this opportunity to speak about the ICJ Advisory Opinion Campaign. Very briefly, my name is Vishal Prasad. I come from Fiji, part of a youth-led organization called the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, with two of my colleagues sitting at the back there. We began this campaign back in 2019 by a group of students at a university who brought this idea of asking our leaders whether they'd be interested in taking climate change to the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, and seeking an advisory opinion. And back in 2019, the government of Vanuatu was the first to respond and say, okay, we are we are confident with this idea, we like this idea, and we are willing to champion this forward. And since 2019, they have been leading this campaign in the political space, culminating in the UN General Assembly resolution in March of last year. So that was a huge achievement for the campaign because it was the first advisory opinion request that was adopted unanimously by the General Assembly. And our work since 2019 up until 2023 has been working on securing that support for the resolution. What is an advisory opinion maybe is also a helpful discussion at this point. So the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the UN, the highest court in the world, and it does two things. One is contentious cases, basically cases between countries when one country takes another country to court. And the second is its advisory function, which is to give opinions on legal matters, to clarify a matter of law for the whole world, essentially. And so there have been, up until this request, 28 advisory opinions issued by the advisory opinion, by the ICJ. And so what it does is, it is not taking, it does not seek to assign blame, it does not seek to take one country to another, or another country to court, or be at that specific level. It's a very general clarification of international law in a specific matter. So what is the question before the court in this instance? So there are two questions that have been put to the court that the court will respond to. And this is important and quite historic that these were the questions that the UN put to the court. The first is asking what are the obligations of states under international law to protect the climate system from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for present and future generations. If I can just take a step back and say that that question relies heavily on a shackle paragraph that you would find in the UN General Assembly resolution that talks about around about 10 sources of international law, or 10 instances of international law that it is using to understand that obligations that countries have. So that is interesting because it is mentioning the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, but it goes beyond that and is asking the court what are obligations beyond the Paris Agreement under the human rights treaties that we have, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the Civil and Political Rights Conventions, and also other legal instruments like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and other principles of international environmental law, such as the prevention of marine pollution, protection of the environment, etc., and transboundary harm. So essentially looking at all of international law to understand state obligations, because right now what countries are doing to address climate change is restricted to just the Paris Agreement and the obligations they have, which we know is not sufficient in moving closer to the climate just world that we want, but also to meeting our targets that we have. And so that is very important because we're now broadening the base of understanding state obligations to include the obligations they have under human rights conventions, etc. The second question that's been asked of the ICJ is a question around legal consequences. So what are the consequences for states that do not meet these obligations? And that's very important because it makes then a specific reference to small island developing states and also peoples of present and future generations. So again, that element of intergenerational equity is very significant in this request because it's asking not just obligations, but for the court to clarify what happens when these obligations are breached and what secondary obligations under international law stem or flow out of that. So all of the points that were mentioned about intergenerational equity, climate justice are encapsulated in these two questions before the court. And that's what the court will respond on. Why is it important on climate justice? I've mentioned a few of the points, but I think it's important to also highlight that the ICJ, and through its opinion, has the potential to clarify many of the obligations of states, but also plug in the gaps within existing mechanisms that we have. So, for example, the gaps within the Paris Agreement that we have that continues to allow countries to delay, allows countries to not commit to as much ambition and accountability that's needed. The ICJ can plug those gaps. And it can also provide an opportunity for the most vulnerable communities, those at the front lines of the climate crisis, to have their voices heard before the world's most high court and issue, and so that their voices are included when the opinion is delivered.
And in terms of success criteria for this case, we already know that it's a huge success that the case has actually been brought to the court. And right now there's a process ongoing with several milestones and deadlines for states to engage with this case and give their opinions on it. What is your evaluation of how it's going so far, and what could go wrong from here in your view?
Yeah, so after the resolution was adopted in March of last year, the ICJ has given countries, all UN member states, deadlines to make submissions to the court on the questions that I've just mentioned. So countries have said what they believe international law is on relating to on those two questions and what their positions are. So the first round of submissions was due on the 22nd of March this year, so that's concluded, and 91 countries and international organizations participated in this. In other words, 91 submissions were received. And since then, the ICJ has now given a second deadline of 15th of August, when countries that did submit their submissions in March have the opportunity to comment on other countries' submissions. So it's an exclusive process in that way, because only those that participated can participate in this upcoming deadline. But after the 15th of August, there will be an opportunity for oral hearings before the court. The ICJ has not given a timeline for this, and it's reserved the deadlines for after the 15th of August. But we are sure that there will be an opportunity for oral hearings in The Hague. So that's just a rough timeline of how things are going and moments that exist in influencing or engaging with the process before the final opinion is released, most likely next year, first half of next year. We have a couple of things that we're concerned about with the process right now, that is, and how it's unfolding. The first is that we had the ITLOS advisory opinion come out about 2-3 weeks ago. This was another advisory opinion by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And because the process at the ICJ is very confidential, we don't know essentially what countries said in their submissions. We're not sure what the level of ambition that they have brought to the ICJ, what legal instruments they have relied on, what they've essentially argued, and that is problematic. Until the ICJ releases these submissions, we won't know for sure. But what we do know is from the engagement of countries in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, certain worrying trends have emerged from there that we don't want to see come out at the ICJ as well. So there are certain themes that certain countries have argued very, very interestingly about. I'll mention about 4 of these. The first is that there have been certain countries in the ITLOS procedure that have questioned the science behind climate change. So they have talked about the 1.5 degree target. They've talked about issues around attribution science and how valuable it is, and how in the place that it is in, whether you could assign causality between an event that's happened to an emission or etc. And so a lot of effort has gone into discredit the science, because without the basis of science, you can't go ahead, because science, it's a legal procedure and you need facts to be on point. And so if you can discredit the science, you've essentially discredited the processes. And that is a very significant concern we have, and we need countries to make submissions that align with the IPCC reports and say that the matter of science is settled under the IPCC. The second point is around applicable law and what is the law in this matter. And so regarding the ITLOS case, so there were certain global north countries that came out and said that the UNCLOS Convention, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is the dominant legal instrument in that case, and the Paris Agreement is the only instrument that's related to climate change. In other words, saying nothing else should be looked at when we talk about climate change. And I mentioned a few other things here, that human rights treaties, conventions, principles of environment law, etc., should also be looked at. So there is an active push, and we think that that would be the case in this opinion request as well, that certain countries will argue that only the Paris Agreement is the dominant source of law that should be used to determine obligations, and they have a good reason to say that because all of the obligations under Paris are voluntary, and they are the only binding obligation is for them to make these voluntary pledges under NDCs, etc. So many countries would be happy with that, but we need that level of ambition to come out, and that can be possible if there are obligations enshrined or considered under all of international. So science, the law that's there. And the third is around human rights law that we also want included. So that's back to the second point. But we really want to focus or for the opinion to have a focus on the human rights impacts of climate change, and this to be the guiding lens behind how countries understand obligations and consequences. And the fourth one is the idea of consequences. Of course, the most ambitious articulations of legal consequences under the law of state responsibility is that states cease the wrongful conduct. Whenever there is a breach of international law, states must cease the conduct, in this case, emissions of greenhouse gases. And second is to provide, they have a duty to provide reparations, to correct the harm that has been suffered. And so that is the consequences that those are two of the most ambitious articulations of the consequences that we hope the ICJ adopts and mentions, because then from there we will have a really strong framework to bring all of those back into spaces like this to make it work. So those are, I would say, the biggest worries we have in terms of submissions right now, and how we want and hopefully how we hope countries will argue more progressive arguments.
That's such a great overview to have, and I guess also a really good way of making sure we campaign in the right way towards the end of this ICJ process. And so the final thing we wanted to talk to you about is how we as Europeans can help this campaign. And now we're in a room full of youth delegates, so the idea was also to talk to you about, and also very much to hear your questions or ideas about how you could engage in this matter. But I also just wanted to say from a state perspective that we know that the European Union has made a submission, and several European countries have made submissions. The Scandinavian countries has gone together in a cluster and made a common submission. And Switzerland, as maybe the only country in this process, has actually published their submission. But we're trying to get a hold of the other European country submissions from a stance of transparency. So that's the state side of the question. But if we look at it from a citizen perspective, Vishal, how do you think we could engage with this case, and specifically as European youth delegates, what would be interesting from your point of view? And then absolutely let's hear those of you around the table also for your questions and ideas.
Sure, I'll be very brief for this. And I realize I've been talking for a while. I think the way forward for us, and some of the ways we need support with is, before that, maybe just giving a sense, there have been 18 countries that have made submissions, 18 European states, plus the European Union, so there have been 19 submissions altogether from the region. What we're doing now at Bonn and beyond is looking at, we've drafted a letter that we are hoping citizens, civil society organizations, or people that have connections with governments and ministries, departments, etc., who could submit these letters on your behalf. You're welcome to edit, amend, and use those letters however you feel. But those letters contain or have the legal positions that I've just mentioned articulated. So it's basically a position paper on saying these are the arguments we want to see in your submission as a country before the ICJ, and these are statements of the highest ambition, perhaps, and we think that could be a way to bring this conversation to countries and say, as a concerned citizen of my country, as a civil society in this country, I'm interested in this process, and I'm hoping that as elected representatives, you take these statements to account, you take these arguments to account. And so we're happy to share that letter with everyone, and with the hope that it can go to these leaders so that they can, in the remainder of the process, make ambitious statements. If they have not, if they've argued counter to these, they have an opportunity to argue again, like change the arguments and make different arguments that are more helpful in the process. So the letter is available and it contains all of the legal aspects that would be helpful. The second is we were speaking about really putting a lot more visibility behind this campaign, so leaders and countries know that there are people watching that, and that we can hold them to account for what they say before the ICJ and the positions they make before the ICJ. In many cases, it could be articulations that are counter to what they would say at the UNFCCC, because the ICJ, if you say anything, it becomes it's part of the court's record and it will be used. And so and states may hide under the confidentiality shield, but we need to make them aware that people are watching and they're concerned about what our countries are mentioning, what your countries are mentioning. So putting that pressure, if that means on media, on social media, or is it making joint statements, press releases, etc., organizing around it, we would very much be interested in hearing your ideas on how we could support that process in making sure that countries are aware that their people are interested in this and are watching as they engage further into the process. We have in Europe an active front of this campaign that's working based out of the Netherlands, so we'd be happy to connect you with people already working on the ground in Europe, so they can also provide you support and assistance and maybe guidance about what to do. But we're also ready from the Pacific to support as well in any way. So after this conversation, we'd be happy to, if you wanted to exchange contacts, we'd be happy to do that and then engage in one-on-one discussions with ideas or questions, etc. Later on, as I mentioned, is going to be the oral hearings, and we really think that this is a great opportunity to demonstrate people power before the court. And so outside The Hague, we were planning a couple of big mobilization moments where we get people together. We can't be inside the court, we can't stand before the court, but to demonstrate the voices of people, the masses out there, and those of the frontline communities, those of young people, both in the frontline communities and outside, to also be able to represent their voices in a creative, friendly, peaceful manner, so that these can also be part of the narrative that's being drafted at the moment. Yeah, and I would say those are the main points that we had, and we'd be keen to hear any of your thoughts or questions about this.
Thanks so much, Vishal. So let's open the floor for questions or comments on this.
I have many questions. Thank you very much. That was really a very brilliant insight.
And maybe just name and organization.
Yeah, I'm Sabina. I'm working with FIAN International, an international human rights organization for the right to food. And we are also engaged in legal proceedings. So it's very interesting to listen to what you said. I have mainly three questions. So one is, what kind of learnings can you take away from your experience with the e-gloss? Did the decision relate very much to the submissions, or was it rather independent, or to what extent was it based on the submissions by states? And the second question, to what extent can states influence, no? And isn't the court an independent body which should take the decision rather on the legal instruments and not based on political considerations? So that is something which is really now very new to me and quite striking, that there are these different levels also regarding the decision taking. So it would be good to have more information from your side on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And let's have your question as well.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is David. I'm on the youth delegation from Austria. Thanks so much. This is lots of very new information, but I think very relevant information. I would obviously love to know, you mentioned that the submissions are mostly confidential, only Switzerland, if not mistaken, published it. Do we know though which states made submissions, and do you have still a sense somehow of where you expect the European states to, where they are on the sort of scale of progressiveness, I suppose, in their submissions. And also, of course, if we could get the list of all European states, I think many of us will be happy to push for more transparency in states we can. Thanks.
The list was just published, posted in our chat.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry. Then we disregard the question.
That was a quick answer. That's very. If you can answer this question in like 1 or 2 minutes, then we have
Sure.
time for some more questions. Also,
Okay.
great questions.
Yeah, so I think the decision of the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea was interesting because it was a very progressive decision. It made a number of pronouncements that went against a lot of the unhelpful arguments that were made by countries. So one was that the court found that greenhouse gas emissions qualified as pollution of the marine environment. It identified that states need to go beyond Paris Agreement and in order to meet their obligations under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was again a huge decision, and we think those will feed into the ICJ proceedings as well, and there's a good level of interaction between them. So countries don't need to bring that out, that the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea has already settled a matter of law that is going to be relevant for the ICJ as well. The extent to which countries can influence this, you're right, it is a legal process and judges and the court has the final discretion on how they will articulate this, but countries, the court does listen to countries and sees their understanding of the state of law relating to the subject, because it's international, operates differently, it's not like local domestic law. So the articulations by the ICJ on the advisory opinion have the potential to be influenced heavily by what states believe the position of international law is, and so hence we need to advance really progressive arguments on the state of international, or what international obligations and consequences should be, and therefore these can then be picked upon by the ICJ. So in the DCLOS case, there were unhelpful arguments and there were positive arguments. The tribunal picked up on the positive arguments quite a lot, but on the spectrum, the DCLOS tribunal is seen as a very progressive court, and so that has had a bearing on the opinion that's been delivered. We still don't know how the ICJ will deliver based on the new judges that have come in, but generally it's been labeled as a neutral / slightly conservative court, and so there needs to be an added push to get the ICJ to issue an opinion that's progressive.
So I saw 2 questions over here. Yeah.
Thank you for all the information. I'm Pablo from Spain, from the Spanish Youth Council. We already know that Spain made the submission, it's already sent, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't get any meeting or something with civil society, so we are worried about that. And we don't know if there is another second submission or something like that for June, but we are trying to push our government, but it's not that easy. So if you have any advice, something like that, because we have a lot of relation with our environmental ministry, but with the foreign affairs ministry, it's so difficult. Thank you.
Yes, there is an opportunity. So the 15th of August is the second round when the submissions are due. So again, if Spain has made a submission, it has the potential to make a second submission. It has the ability to make a second submission in August. What we think, what has worked for us is providing or asking governments for an explanation of whether they want to include civil society or not. Perhaps the letter that we mentioned earlier could be a hook that can begin that conversation to see or try to ask governments. You've made a submission, what was it about? Did it include civil society? Because it isn't a government submission, it is a state submission. So there should be a level of inclusivity in the process, and on that basis perhaps there could be some arguments that can help you get into the door. We are happy if we have got connections on our side with the government connections we have. There may be some openings, so be happy to stay in touch as well. But I'd say the letter and perhaps those could be a starting point for this.
If I can just add a legal point, that there's also the European countries are signatories of the Aarhus Convention on transparency in environmental decisions, which also involves international processes, and we're looking at an let's chat about this afterwards, those of us who know about this, but we're trying to look at how substantial that actually would be in this case in terms of states or governments being obliged to hearing civil society in this type of case, which would be a really useful tool. Next question.
Thank you very much for your time presentation. I was twofold. Can you just shortly describe more like the European branch you described as that you have like working also, so that it would be obviously can also reach afterward after the session, but just to get some sort of grasp where you're going in the European scale, and then like secondly, what have been the kind of main arguments for countries not publishing their submitted statements?
Thanks for that. So the European Front of so it's under the a youth organization that we formed to lead the global campaign on the ICJ called the World's Youth for Climate Justice. It has different regional fronts. It's got a front in Latin America, in Asia, in the Caribbean, Africa, and a front in Europe. And so they work, they have then under that regional front different national fronts. So they've got campaigners in different countries within Europe. I don't have the complete list, I can get that to you. But again, they have the similar focus of trying to see which of the European countries would be interested in advancing these progressive arguments, also leading the more public-facing aspects of the campaign around mobilizing civil society, gathering endorsements behind this, and also trying to insert the voices of civil society within submissions in terms of with regard to evidence. Also, that's an important aspect, but also just general arguments as well. And so they are also leading the work on mobilizations, which is essentially what I mentioned around oral hearings. When we do go to the court, the front is going to be very useful in bringing people together. So I can put everyone in touch if that'd be helpful, and then that can provide a framework for working within Europe if that's helpful. The second question on why confidentiality. Unfortunately, it's the court statutes that the court has said limit it to be confidential, and so many countries, whenever we raise this argument, okay, would you want to make your submissions public, they give the argument that the court has said it's confidential and we want to oblige with the procedures of the court, and so that has unfortunately been the barrier we faced.
Thanks for clarifying, and let's see if you can make it very brief and the answer
Yes.
very brief. Let's try.
Making the answer brief might be more difficult. I'm just wondering what the media attention you've been able to raise for this question, and also like if we in our respective countries would want to try to raise media awareness on this issue, do you think that could be an effective strategy at kind of creating that pressure, or?
Absolutely, media has been useful, but it's because the campaign is very even, very technical. Media don't usually cover when something big happens. So the last big moment was when the General Assembly resolution was adopted, and we had a big spike in media attention on this. But since then, because the submissions are also closed door and no one knows what they've said, it's been difficult. So if there is any potential inroads in getting media attention on this, that could also help in adding to that visibility angle and public advocacy angle that I talked about in Europe.
I think that's all we have for now in the ICJ case, but thank you very much, Vishal, for clarifying all these different aspects of the case and making us all more knowledgeable on how we can engage. And let's make sure afterwards to exchange contacts, and you're very welcome to stand by for the next item on the agenda, which is the COP29. But to make it more specific, of course, the context around COP29, and let me just move over to this chair so I can talk to you, Emin. So I already gave sort of the headlines for why we're bringing this up, and let's get back to how you as European youth delegates can engage in terms of the COP29 in Azerbaijan. What we wanted to convey to you is some context information about what the situation is currently in Azerbaijan, as that is highly concerning, as some of you already may know. And we are concerned as global civil society as well, in terms of how can we best show solidarity at this point with Azerbaijani civil society, and what are our rights and opportunities in terms of actually participating in a rights-based way at the COP29. So Emin, if you can briefly introduce yourself and tell us about how do you see the situation right now for Azerbaijani civil society after Azerbaijan has been nominated as COP president.
Thank you, Sigrid, and thank you for attending our conversation. My name is Emin Huseynov. I'm former youth activist, but I still feel myself like youth activist. Now, the last 20 years I'm working as like human rights defender, human rights advocate, and my specializations is raising awareness with the European institutions around problems with the human rights in Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is a member of the Council of Europe since 2001. We are also a member of the OEC Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Azerbaijan part of the EU Eastern Partnership Program, as like 5 other member states like Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, and we Azerbaijan part of this program. So that is like somehow magically we able to take a part of this European family 20 years ago. Since this, what we start to observe in Azerbaijan, degradation with European human rights values. Like, because before to get this membership in the Council of Europe, Azerbaijani government spent approximately 10 years to negotiate with the Council of Europe to improve their own national and juridical system to European value standards, to make them applicable for European Convention for Human Rights. And now this document is main document, and highest court for Azerbaijan is the European Court for Human Rights. So, but since we are a member of the Council of Europe, like year by year, and the current ruling family representatives decide to stay, in fact, forever, and that's because we don't have any kind of democratic transitions or peaceful opportunity to change the government. Situation with democracy and special participations of youth and youth engagement in democratization of Azerbaijan also degraded. Today, for the last 20 years, let's say, we have, let's say, systematic crackdown against youth communities, against youth activists, youth political activists, and that's for this we have always between 50 to 100 political prisoners per year. They are arrested ahead of elections, right after election, with the people going and protest for electoral violations. And it's continued the revolving door, because Azerbaijan Council of Europe members, hundreds of political prisoners systematically released because the European Court for Human Rights make decisions for the same people after 10 years, after 5 years, arrested for the same reasons. The one reasons, what is different, like youth activists, like, which is arrested, let's say, 10 years ago, when they are 22, 23 years old, today they are like 35, 36 years old. Same people, they are arrested again for the same fabricated charges. And I can tell you like very clear, for example, I'm 44 years old and I'm living in Azerbaijan. Like my countries have 34 years of existence as independence since Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And today we have only 1 year democratically elected government. When after former Soviet KGB general, which is staying on the ruling power since from 1969, he came back to the power, he made a coup, and since 1993, he's staying on the power until he died. In 2003, he gives his power to his son. With fabricated elections, current president takes to the president floor, and we as like youth activists make a first protest against this falsified election in 2003. Today is 2024, like 21 years of my life. this government still from, like literally still part of my life, like half of the life. That imagine like people which is like 20 years old, they didn't see anyone else. Like we are living again, it's like Council Denmark or Spain or Baltic states or recently joined to Council of Europe Family States. Nobody has this kind of precedence. Maybe the worst situation is like in Belarus, which is still also not good excuse for Azerbaijan, but the Belarus is not a member of the Council of Europe. So that's, today, since we are Aliyev, like current president, which is already decided to run for the fifth presidential term, imagine, because we hosted COP29, this guy decided to do snap presidential elections 2 years earlier. The election is supposed to be in the end of 2025. Because the guy managed to get the host country status, he decided to use great opportunities for him to invite all of these European global leaders, like more than 150 heads of the states supposed to attend to the COP29. It's kind of give him like legitimizations to upgrade his upcoming 7 years in the global political environment to say, look, yeah, I'm strong, recently re-elected president, and let's engage with me. And if you ask what is the role of the Azerbaijan youth community, right after we got the host country status, they jailed more than 30 brave young activists, like young environmental activists, young women rights activists, young journalists. It's all of these people which is according to the Azerbaijani law and according to the general standards, they are like representatives of youth generations, people from 18 to 30 years old. And today's number is of the political prisoners, imagine, increase from 100 to 300 people. And sometimes we don't have time to counting our arrested colleagues, our youth activists, because civil society completely destroyed in Azerbaijan. We have the same, similar like a foreign agent law, which is Russia have and Belarus, and then today is Georgia also planning to adopt something similar. But Azerbaijan is law which is regulated non-profit organizations, much worse compared with even Russian, Belarusian or Georgian. And still we didn't feel any kind of strong solidarity from the European institution, because they find Azerbaijan as like a useful partner who provided them oil and gas since like a war, Russian war against Ukraine started, when European energy market lose the opportunities to get free oil and gas from Russia. Azerbaijan said, look, guys, we are here, we're happy to make a deal with you. And now all of this European political leadership looks like they are mostly focused on agenda, or engaged with energy issues. They are less speaking about like a climate change agenda. They are less speaking about like increasing of the role, gives some kind of equal opportunities for the civil society. Imagine all civil society partners of EU operated programs in Azerbaijan, they are jailed or they are under travel ban. It's more than 200 political civil society young activists right now just literally under travel ban, which it means for the government especially uses travel ban system, because they can't arrest like every day 1 or 2 people, they arrest just 1 person or 2 person per week. There's like it's kind of, you know, repression machines can't work faster, but what they find like easy mechanisms, they just like put you to trouble and say, look, you are under investigation, you have to be clever, don't speak with any foreign journalist who's supposed to attend to the Azerbaijan. If you speak with someone from your community, like let's say from student organizations in abroad, you have to be very clever. You have to take only about positive things. So we appreciate our government efforts related with stuff. So this kind of situation which is COP29 make like some kind of political paradise for Ali and make like literally humanitarian disaster and political disaster for civil society, and especially for youth generation, because what government successfully managed to do, they have destroyed for the last 31 years of this existence of this regime, whole generation of opposition. And when they understand, well, even like in the very repressive environment, when they're able to destroy all generation, young generation who are able to use like new social media platforms, blockchain platforms, they able to engage and digitalize like a democratization process in the very repressive regime. They say, look, we already, let's say, fix the problem with the old generation of civil society representatives. Let's attack the last one, young people. And they're most vulnerable group right now. Most of them attack, and most of them even not able to come and speak here in front of you. And maybe it's good chance for this community at least to take a chance to raise awareness around their problems. And Azerbaijan is kind of biggest part of Azerbaijan population. It's quite young generation, and but they are like staying like as like voiceless community.
And how can we look at, is there any way of seeing COP29 as an opportunity for Azerbaijani civil society? How can we as European or other representatives of civil society assist in shedding a light on these issues and maybe helping to improve or change the predicaments of Azerbaijani civil society?
Just for the reason because many of our colleagues was able to contribute, young colleagues were able to contribute for our awareness activities around the COP in Azerbaijan. They're quite vulnerable right now. And nobody knows what can be happen after, right after when the COP is finished. And okay, if they not touch most of them until COP, usually what traditionally they start to do, they start to jail people after elections. This is some kind of vendetta operation start. And for us, it's a great opportunity if you, like European youth community, able to take the lead on this process and able to raise and make a stronger awareness around this problem and cooperate with Azerbaijani civil society. Most of us now, unfortunately, supposed to operate in exile. I live last 9 years in Switzerland. They deprived my citizenship, even for my activities. I'm like stateless person. I'm not able to go to the COP. And today is the last chance for us somehow manage to mobilize our all possible like-minded partners around this problem and push as much as possible to Azerbaijan government. We are your national government, we are your national delegation, because unfortunately in our region, young generations voiceless. Imagine since from 2015 in Azerbaijan, we have informal restriction for making protests. And our president is saying, for look, it's several times mentioned in this survey, responsible young, he will never need to protest against his government. He needs to be work for his government, for his country, for his national interests. And if you participate in any kind of avanturistic protests, like for some kind of democratic illusions, this is against our national interests, and that's what this person several times said for the last, let's say, 5 years. It's kind of alert for young generation, and like let's say old social and political life of youth communities, especially in universities, like controlled by the national law enforcement agencies. Like it's special, like Stasi groups, like a secret spies inside the students' trade unions. We don't have independent trade unions at all. We don't have not only like trade unions for students. We don't have even any kind of small independent trade union. The last trade union which is there is journalists, like most of these members of this trade union arrested. Another representatives, for example, we have young entrepreneurs who decide to establish like a trade union just a year ago. All of them also arrested, all leadership, and they are arrested like, you know, sometimes they're using simple charges. They're arresting you in the street, put to your pocket like a 3 gram of cannabis and say, well, look, you are drug dealer. And you're going to the prison for the 5 or 7 or 8 years, and even the European Court for Human Rights, after 5 or 6 years of examination of your case, if you're quite lucky, because the European Court for Human Rights also sometimes takes like 7 to 10 years to make a decision on your case. And our president said, well, okay, we have never ever prosecuted anyone. If someone's sick, we are Azerbaijani courts prosecute him illegally. We are a member of the Council of Europe. Please go to the Council of Europe, European Court for Human Rights, and apply there. And if you are innocent, the court may decide. But decision make it after 10 years. And imagine when you are arrested as like a young activist, when you're 20 years old, you spend 10 years in prison, and after European Court for Human Rights says, okay, you are arrested illegally, you have to pay compensation to this guy, 10,000 euros. Imagine, you spend 10 years in prison and after you receive 10,000 euros. Or you're extremely tortured, you lose your health, you're psychologically and physically traumatized, and again, after 10 years, they say, okay, we are we are paying you like compensation. That's it. That is what reality is. And for the COP29, I think we need to maximize like climate diplomacy around these problems. Because if someone says, well, it's not political event, we need to talk about culture, it's like, about climate, it's unfair with in relations and perspective with solidarity of our colleagues who spent their life in Azerbaijan jail. I think it's not fair and good to make some kind of international climate change festival on the bones and bloods of Azerbaijani people, of Azerbaijani civil society and Azerbaijani youth.
We have a few minutes left for questions and comments, so I think, and also applauses if. So let's open the floor and have a bit of conversation about this. If anyone has comments or questions.
But I just want to say, don't worry, you have to go there, Azerbaijan. And not say,
It's not us.
yeah, it's only us. You are partly safe if you go there. You have to go and speak up on behalf of us. That's it.
And I think an important point in all of this is that when those of us will participate at COP29, when we go there, that's not where we're going to cooperate with Azerbaijani civil society. That happens before, and it happens in Europe, different countries where you might meet or have exiled Azerbaijani activists living. So that's also maybe a way of engaging in this very important case for Azerbaijan.
Yeah, and please make sure, because the government prepared like some kind of package of the GONGOs, like government-dependent NGOs or youth organizations, to take some kind of leadership during the COP29 in Azerbaijan. Most of them try to position themselves as like completely independent stakeholders. Just spend some time for several hours, make some kind of due diligence. Who is your potential partner? Because many European, especially user organizations, when they meet with me, like in different meetings, they say, "Oh, we have like a branch in Azerbaijan." I said, "Well, who is your focal point?" They say, "Oh, this person." I said, "Oh, it's interesting, but you know, this guy also take a lead in the ruling party's user organization." And he said, "It's like a independent partner from Azerbaijan. Make sure for at least do not have like some kind of not independent partners. And if you need any kind of help, please contact with Global Focus, and we planning to make some kind of informational dispatches and making hotlines, and we try to inform as many stakeholders as possible via our online website, which is we are planning to launch in the next week. And if you really need any kind of advice without like with any kind of publicity with the Chatham House rules, feel free to ask us. And it's totally understandable for us. For everyone who going to Azerbaijan need to care about his safety, but you need to be there. Don't give chance to this kind of authoritarian leaders to use the climate change agenda to whitewash themselves.
So we need to be there, is
Yeah.
the main takeaway, I think. Thank you so much, Emin, for your time.
Thanks for inviting.
And we will have to wrap up here, but as no one else is coming into the room at this moment, we do have some time for networking and exchanging addresses and so forth. So thank you so much for your time.